Hello, I'm Shane Hendren with Grande, and in this video I'm going to show you how I did this. How I designed and made this belt buckle with a cameo in it. If you want to see how, keep watching. You know, I got to looking at this cameo, and you know, it's really, it's just amazing, the detail of it, and it's so, you can even see like the textures of the cloth down here wrapped around her hip and everything, and there's a pattern on the handkerchief that she's holding in her hand. It's just amazing, the detail. And I thought, you know, I want to do something that really accentuates the detail in the cameo within the buckle. So what I decided was, I think I'm going to go with more of a Baroque sort of design. So what I'll do is I'll just rough out this 2x3. 2x3 is the most common dress buckles, or some people call them gentlemen's buckles, but I have a lot of ladies who wear them, so I wouldn't necessarily call them a gentleman's buckle exclusively. So I'm going to get this rough idea, and I think I'm going to go to at least 2.5 by 3.5. So I'm going to enlarge this, and this is like why I like the graph paper, because I'm doing it to scale. I know exactly the size that I'm working with and everything. This idea I have here of the scroll growing out of the center here and then coming back around. And you can see, even in these rough sketches I'm doing, you know, there's slight variations from one to another. I sort of do that on purpose, because what I'm doing is I'm trying to find the one that is going to fit this size of buckle and give me the right look, if you will, because I'm going to come around here and like right here, I can put some accent stones right here. A buckle is a piece of jewelry that you want to be able to see from, 10 feet away, especially with something like a cameo in it. This is the type of jewelry that it says as much about the wearer as it does the artist who designed it and made it. You put this back in there and you think, oh, okay, now I want to see how that comes together, how that looks. And then maybe I'll go back to this, there's this again. I'm looking for what is gonna create the best framework for this cameo. That's the idea of a buckle of this type. Whatever you're putting in the center, this is just a framework for it. In and of itself be beautiful, but it should accentuate that centerpiece without being too distracting. We want something that will draw the viewer in and cause somebody to want to look more closely and say, hey, what is that? I want to see that, All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this fine silver bezel wire and make a bezel. I chose this tall bezel wire because I'm going to dome the buckle slightly. All right, now we're going to fuse. I'll use some handy flux here to flux my joint. This solderite pad looks kind of bad, but it's not. All right, now we're going to fuse this bezel. It's another reason why I chose this taller fine silver bezel, because it allows me to, you can see how it's getting hot there on the edge near where I'm heating it up. So if it kind of crinkles up there, it's no big deal. I can file that away or forge it down a little, even it out. Okay, got our bezel fused. See how it fits this little cameo? Look at that. Got a good fit there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and level off the back of this. You can see it's slightly uneven. I'm just blown away by how beautiful these are. They're amazing. I'm using my Fordham SR motor with these sanding discs. I tend to use these in place of filing. Traditionally, or a long time ago, I suppose I would have filed this all level and flat. But now I use these sanding discs. They're faster, And in some ways, I think they're more accurate. With a file, you have a tendency to push the metal, and when you're dealing with something like this fine silver bezel, you know, you have a tendency to bend it and everything, and the sanding disc itself does all the work while it spins, so you don't need to utilize a lot of force. You're less likely to distort or misshape the piece that you're sanding on. And I've just gotten to where I really enjoy them. They're handy, and that would have taken me easily twice as long to file. And you can see how that leveled that off, sits absolutely level on that piece of metal. Look at that. With a file, I would have had to have come back in here and shaped and reshaped, but that Cameo fits perfect right back in there. And like I said, I got it taller because then I have wiggle room as I'm working along. So the next thing, this is the twisted pattern wire, and they cut it with just some wire cutters, so it left a slight bevel on the cut. So what I want to do is I want to take this file and I want to flatten that end. What this does is I'm going to use this pattern wire to create a framework around the Cameo. This is aesthetically pleasing, but it's also there to serve as a support to the bezel and protect it when it's being worn. It's not just hanging out there. It creates sort of a buffer around it. And all the while I'm doing this, I'm still thinking about the design. I have those two rough sketches that we started earlier. I'm mulling that over in my head as I work on this, thinking about what's going to look best, what's going to accentuate this Cameo the best. And most of my shaping I do in this situation is all done by hand with my fingers. This wire is dead soft, so it's easy to manipulate and shape. Okay, now what I'll do is, with the stone still in there so that everything is held in place, start my cut. Now I don't want to risk damaging that, so I'll take that out of the way to finish my cut off. Once again, I'll use the sanding disc to clean things up. Gives me two smooth faces to solder together. And again, I'm using my fingers. The less I use pliers or anything, the less likely I am to mar and scar the silver. So you can see there, got a perfect seam. The lines all match up. So now, double check the fit. Looks like it's going to be right on. It's ready to solder. Once again, I'll use my handy flux to flux up my joint. I'm going to use hard solder. So I'm just going to clip off a little piece of hard solder here real quick. I'm soldering on a solderite pad. These are my preferred pads for soldering. So I'm going to melt my solder and pick it up with this titanium pick. Then I'll heat my piece. And on this piece, I'm not worried about fire scale, because fire scale will actually work to my advantage, because we're going to want to darken in those lower portions of the pattern wire with either black max or liver of sulfur. So if it gets some fire scale on it, that's okay, because we'll polish the high areas and make them bright and white, and then the low areas are going to be dark anyhow. In a situation like this, we're not worried about fire scale. So what I'm doing here is I'm sawing through the top filigree portion, which is 14 gauge sterling silver. I'm using a 1/0 saw blade in a German saw frame to do this work. For me, the filigree has to be laid out in such a way that once I engrave it, there's no adjustments that need to be made. Everything has to be balanced and contoured in such a way that it's going to enhance the engraving, or the engraving is going to enhance it, and not going to point out or denote any inconsistencies or imbalances. So not only is the design important, but sawing it out correctly and accurately is also important. I print a lot of my designs on adhesive printer paper, label paper, and just overlay that onto the sheet that I want to cut. Here I'm using an X-Acto knife to cut the lines, which are going to leave scribe marks that I can follow later when I engrave. I have found over the years that this is a very quick, very easy way to transfer a design to a sheet of silver accurately. I use a barrette file to remove all of the saw marks, or as many of them as I can. I use a needle file to get into those really tight areas. And once I'm done with that, then I attach it to the thermoloc. I heat the thermoloc with a industrial heat gun in preparation for pressing the cutout filigree into it. This is what's going to hold it while I use my engraver to bevel the edges. I'm beveling the edges now before I solder it, because once I've soldered it into place, as well as the bezel cups, it makes it much more difficult to get those beveled edges cut cleanly. And then I stamp the back of the buckle with my maker's mark and quality stamps in preparation for soldering the overlay filigree onto this back plate. So here I'm soldering the filigree that I cut out, the overlay on top of the buckle back. I've coated both the buckle back and the filigree with handy flux solder, and I'm using hard silver solder to solder these two pieces together. You'll notice I have two different picks primarily that I use. One of them is made out of an old file, and the other one's made out of welding rod that I use to move the solder around, as well as push the overlay down onto the back plate. These are handmade. I've made these many years ago, and I use these especially on buckles because they're larger and the heat doesn't transfer through them quite as easily. This is a very hot process, and you have to move very quickly. Once the flux is all burnt away, it's unlikely that you're going to get a good solder joint. So what I do is I heat the entire buckle, and then I use the flame to draw the solder around the entire buckle, and you can see those bright lines are the solder where it's flown through into the edges, and that's how you know you have a good solder joint. So once I have all of the components soldered to the buckle back, the filigree as well as the rope edge that goes around the Cameo, I will cut away all of the excess silver, giving me the final profile of the buckle. I will also go in later and pierce the areas that I want cut out as well. Not everything will be cut out. What I'm doing here is I'm using my Forto micromotor to go in with a burr and clean up all the excess solder and the edges to make a perfect seat for the bezel that's going to be soldered in place here. So getting all this cleaned up, leveling it off, will ensure that it has a good seat and is secure. So once I got all those seats made, I can solder the bezel cups in place. These are very heavy gauge bezels. They're I believe 12 gauge is what the silver is, and I'm soldering them on a solderite pad. I like the solderite pads because they reflect the heat very well. With tube settings soldered in place, I'm cutting out the back because 10mm sapphires are going to be tube set here, and what you want is you want the light to be able to shine through those. So we cut the backing out so that that'll occur. So what I'm doing here is I'm measuring the loop for the buckle. That's the part that the belt attaches to. I like to make them no less than 1.25 inches, so it'll fit on 1.25 inch belt, because that's a very common belt size. So it's important that everything is square and symmetrical from side to side and balanced, because if it's not, then the belt will, when it attaches, the buckle will hang crooked, and it makes it uncomfortable as well as visually unattractive. So I take a lot of time to make sure that I get these measurements precise. I've had people in the past say, well, you're just freehanding that when I cut it and everything, and I am. But I've done a lot of these. I'll go in after I make the cuts, and then I'll use a triangle file to clean them up and even them up. And I prefer to use parallel jaw pliers when I'm shaping metal like this because it gives me a better grip. And it's less likely to damage the round silver. It doesn't dig into it, if you will. It's all about getting things even and square and straight, because at the end of the day, this is what the belt attaches to, and if it's not square and straight, then your buckle won't hang right. So I'm cleaning up all the cutouts right here with a round file, getting rid of all the saw marks, smoothing everything up. Want to make them smooth and clean as possible. That way, when it comes time to polish and everything, it doesn't take as much work. So I'm filing the outside as well, smoothing everything up. This is also when I start to shape the buckle. I prefer not to have sharp edges because they'll dig into you. So I'll begin to round those edges off with a file, and it'll make the polishing process much easier. So you got to use the right file for the job. Here I'm using a triangle needle file. That way I can get into all the small nooks and crannies. I use my Forta micromotor oftentimes to clean out these holes like you see here to get a good tight fit. Cutting out the overlays on this belt buckle require precision saw blades. That's why I choose the laser gold saw blades. I'm using the 2/0 blades to do this work. Here you see me laying out with a pencil some guidelines for what I'm going to be engraving, and then I'll be engraving it with a 120 carbide from GRS, and I'm using a GRS engraver's ball to hold my block of wood with the buckle on top of it. It's probably the easiest and best way that I have found to do these buckles like this. Gives you a lot of control and helps you to get really good cuts. To shape my buckles, I've been doing this for over a decade now. I use the Bonnie Doon press. This is a Bonnie Doon 2010 press, one of the originals, and I'm using the 80 durometer rubber and a curved metal surface to get just the perfect curve for a buckle. So when I dome the buckle, it domes everything, and the back of the Cameo is flat. So what I'm doing here is I'm using some frets hammers and some frets repose tools to flatten out the seat where the Cameo is going to be. I have to make this as flat as possible because if there's even a slight curve to it and pressure is put on the front of that Cameo, it could crack and break. So I go through great pains here to make sure I get it good and flat for the Cameo to sit on. So Handy Flux is my flux of choice, especially on big pieces like these belt buckles, because it doesn't burn away too quickly. It gives you enough time to get in there and get everything soldered into place. But take note that I only put it where I need it, because it's going to promote the flow of the solder. So if you put it everywhere, that solder in this case could flow into those areas that I've engraved and ruined the engraving. So you have to be careful about that. So now here in these shots showing me solder, notice how I use the solderite pad to reflect the heat onto the buckle. I only point the heat directly where I want it towards the end when everything is heated and I'm ready to flow the solder, because the solder is going to follow that heat. So I want it to pull down and then fill in any of the voids. It's a very quick process. So here I'm soldering the last solder joint. This is the fine silver bezel. You can see all the solder chips on the inside surrounding it. I do all of my preheating from the outside, and I don't introduce the flame until I'm ready to flow the solder. And you can see I'm using my pick to help ensure the solder fills all of the gaps and there are no open spaces. Midas Black Max. That's what I'm going to darken my lines with. I'm using the Midas Black Max to fill in all of these voids, all of the background, so that it'll give it more depth and contrast. And I also use it around this wire rope, and it'll frame things up better. the darkening of the background draws you into the piece more. And this is going to happen anyway, because over time it'll begin to oxidize and change color. So we're just speeding that up for art's sake. Design, creativity, making it super pretty and cool, because that's what we do. Anyhow, fill up all those low-lying areas with some Midas Black Max. To set the Black Max, I rinse it in water, and that is what solidifies it. So I use separating disc to clean up excess solder and shape things. They do a real good job, but you got to be careful because they're really aggressive. And then I typically follow those up with Eve Flex polishing wheels. They allow me to only remove as much material as I want to at a time, and really get into the nooks and crannies and get the fine details taken care of. And then I follow that up. I soften everything with the radial discs. This allows me to only remove as much material as I want to. The buffer, which comes next, can be much more aggressive and take away more than you're really prepared to take away. So this gives me a lot more control. So what I'm doing here is buffing the buckle now. So I'll get in there with the first step will be scratch removal and a little bit of shaping, making sure I get those edges all rounded over so there's no sharp edges or anything. The last thing you want on a belt buckle is sharp edges. So you want to make sure you get them rounded over good. Get it all polished up here on the buffer, and then move on to the next step. Okay, I've got this buckle where it's all polished up. We're ready to start doing the engraving and the stone setting. It's looking real good. My preferred way to secure it is with thermoloc. So what I do is I got this base here covered up with thermoloc, and I use this heat gun to heat the thermoloc up, and then I press the buckle into the thermoloc. Now keep in mind, it can burn you. I mean, it gets as hot as you make it, and you can see in the past I've scorched it and burned it there. It will burn. And you can see on the back of this buckle what I need is I need for this piece and this piece to be secured in the thermoloc. I don't really want it going through the holes so much, but that it's fine if it does because it's soft and you can just cut it away. But the thermoloc has to be soft enough so that these pieces are what's holding it in place. And the reason why I like this thermoloc is because it's not going to adversely affect the finish on this buckle. So it's not going to scratch it or ding it in any way. Whereas the old method of holding things with pins in your vise and all, you ran into the potential of it damaging your piece. So I make sure that I orient this so I know that the bottom of the buckle is facing the bottom of the ball. And press this into place. Press it into that thermoloc. I try to center it so that it's right in the center of my ball. It's a little bit off, but all I got to do is move this plate down, and now I've got the buckle itself right in the center. That makes it a lot easier. It's also easier to see in my microscope when it's centered like that. So now all I got to do is let it cool. What I'm doing is laying out lines. I want everything to be even and perfectly spaced, so I use these dividers to give me some layout lines, something that I can work to so that I have perfect edges, and then I'll start engraving and cutting away. So now that I've got all my guidelines done, I can get in there and start engraving or cutting away all of the edges of the scroll work. I'm putting a nice clean bevel on everything that's gonna frame that scroll work in and give it some real definition, and also give the buckle more contour and depth. Now's when the buckle starts coming to life. Engraving takes what was a flat, shiny piece of metal and gives it depth and definition. The scroll work is really taken straight from nature. So how I engrave this is it mimics nature, and I really feel like when I engrave something, it really does give it a life of its own. Every individual line is an individual cut, so it takes a lot of precision and a lot of focus while I'm doing this work. So here I'm cutting the seats for the stones using my engraver to do this. At this point, everything that I'm doing requires great precision. Really, it's imperative that you get the sizes cut right, and the seats have to be flush and smooth, because if anything is out of balance or uneven, what can happen is that stone, if pressure is applied to it, it can break. So this part of the process, the stone setting and everything as we finish up here, is imperative that you do it very, very well. And the other thing is, when I'm polishing, I'm using my micromotor and these silicone polishing wheels. Even doing that requires a great deal of precision. It's all about knowing how much pressure to apply, knowing where to apply it, and then removing anything that's any excess, so that the final product, everything is as perfect as it can be. Looking back on all of this, you don't think about it when you're doing it, but it's a lot of very detailed and precision work to get that final product that somebody is going to wear and have for generations and generations, hopefully passed down from one family member to the next. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any additional questions, please contact us.